In a forgotten hangar in Hartwell, South Dakota, sat a 1947 experimental aircraft that would become the bridge between a struggling single father's desperation and a billionaire's 30-year search for closure. Joseph Clark had no idea that the mysterious plane he discovered would connect him to Helen Mansfield, one of America's wealthiest women, whose aviator husband had vanished decades ago along with his revolutionary aircraft. As Joseph and his twins, Violet and Blake, began restoring the forgotten machine in their small workshop, they unknowingly set in motion events that would attract the attention of ruthless developers, test the limits of their community's support, and ultimately lead to an offer that would transform not just their family's future, but the entire landscape of aviation restoration in America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through the gaps in the metal siding of Hartwell Aviation Services like a knife through paper. Joseph Clark hunched deeper into his worn work jacket as he bent over the engine of a Cessna 172, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision, despite the cold that had settled into his bones. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the cluttered workshop floor, where tools lay scattered among oil-stained rags and coffee cups that had long since grown cold. Outside, the South Dakota prairie stretched endlessly under a gray sky that promised snow before morning. The wind howled across the flat expanse, rattling the windows of the small aviation repair shop that had been Joseph's livelihood for the past 8 years. Since losing his job at the regional aircraft maintenance facility, this modest operation had been all that stood between his family and financial ruin. Joseph wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back from the Cessna's engine compartment, studying the complex maze of wires and components with the eye of someone who had spent most of his adult life understanding how things flew. At 42, his dark hair was already showing streaks of silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many late nights spent working under these same flickering lights. The shop itself reflected years of careful maintenance on a shoestring budget. Every tool had its place. Every part was catalogued and stored with military precision. Joseph had learned organization from his father, who had served as an aircraft engineer during World War II. The old man's influence was everywhere in the shop, from the vintage aviation posters on the walls to the meticulous record-keeping system that tracked every repair, every part, every hour of labor. The front door chimed as someone entered, bringing with them a gust of cold air that made Joseph shiver. Richard Morrison appeared in the doorway between the front office and the workshop, his tall frame filling the space as he surveyed the controlled chaos of the repair bay. At 65, Richard had the bearing of a man who had spent decades around aircraft, first as a pilot in the Air Force and later as the manager of Hartwell Regional Airport. "Working late again, Joe," Richard said, his voice carrying the warm concern of an old friend. Joseph looked up from the engine, managing a tired smile. "This old bird needs to be airworthy by tomorrow morning. The owner's flying to Denver for his daughter's wedding." Richard nodded, understanding the pressures that came with running a small aviation business. He had watched Joseph struggle to keep the shop afloat after his wife Grace had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise 14-year-old twins while trying to maintain a business that barely broke even in the best of times. "How are Violet and Blake doing?" Richard asked, settling onto a worn stool near the workbench. "They're good kids," Joseph replied, returning his attention to the engine. "Violet's been spending more time out here, asking questions about how everything works. She's got good hands for this kind of work. Blake's more interested in the business side of things. He keeps telling me we need better marketing." Richard chuckled. "Smart kids. They get that from their father." Joseph's expression darkened slightly as he continued working. Smart kids deserve better than watching their father. Barely scraped by month after month. The shop's bleeding money, Richard. I'm 3 months behind on the lease, and Anthony Harrington's been sniffing around again. The mention of Anthony Harrington's name brought a scowl to Richard's weathered face. The real estate developer had been systematically buying up properties around the airport, promising to bring prosperity to Hartwell through commercial development. In reality, his plans would transform the small agricultural community into another generic strip mall destination, destroying the character that had defined the town for generations. Harrington's a vulture, Richard said with obvious distaste. He's been pressuring half the businesses in town to sell, offering just enough money to make desperate people think twice about holding on to their dreams. Joseph set down his wrench and leaned against the workbench, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. The kids don't know how bad things really are. I've been shielding them from the worst of it, but I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The bank's threatening to foreclose on the house, and without this shop, I don't know what I'd do for work. Richard studied his friend's face, seeing the weight of responsibility that pressed down on Joseph's shoulders like a physical burden. You know, there might be something that could help. I've been meaning to talk to you about it for weeks now. Joseph raised an eyebrow. His interest piqued despite his exhaustion. What kind of something? Richard stood and walked to the window that overlooked the airport grounds, his gaze settling on a cluster of old hangars that sat at the far end of the property. Most had been abandoned for years, their corrugated metal sides streaked with rust and their windows broken or boarded up. You remember Hangar 5, the one at the end of the old military section? Richard asked. Joseph nodded. Hartwell Regional had been built on the site of a former military training facility that had been active during the Korean War. When the military pulled out in the early 1960s, the town had converted the airfield for civilian use, but several of the original hangars had been left to deteriorate. I was doing inventory on the old hangars last week, checking to see what condition they're in, Richard continued. Most of them are empty, just dust and bird nests, but Hangar 5 had something interesting locked away in the back corner. Richard's voice took on a quality that made Joseph look up from his work. There was excitement there, barely contained beneath the older man's typically reserved demeanor. What kind of interesting? Joseph asked. An aircraft, covered with tarps. He'd probably been sitting there for 30 years or more. I only got a quick look at it, but from what I could see, it's something special. Old, but not like the usual Pipers and Cessnas we see around here. This looked custom-built, experimental. Maybe. Joseph felt a spark of curiosity ignite in his chest, the first genuine interest he had felt in weeks. Experimental aircraft from the 50s and 60s could be worth serious money if they're in decent condition. Some collectors pay 6 figures for the right plane. That's what I was thinking, Richard said, turning back from the window. The hangar's been sealed up tight, so whatever's in there has been protected from the weather. If you could get it running again, restore it properly, it might be exactly the kind of project that could turn your finances around. Joseph wiped his hands more thoroughly, his mind already racing with possibilities. He had always been drawn to restoration work, finding satisfaction in taking something broken and making it whole again. It was what had attracted him to aviation in the first place, the idea that with enough skill and patience, almost anything could be made to fly again. Who owns the hangar? He asked. Technically, the airport authority does, but it's been abandoned so long that nobody really pays attention to it. The aircraft inside is probably considered abandoned property at this point. If you could restore it and establish ownership through the proper legal channels, it could be yours. Joseph felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. When can we take a look at it? Richard grinned, recognizing the spark of determination that had returned to his friend's eyes. How about right now? I've got the keys and the kids are probably doing homework. We could drive over there and see what we're dealing with. Joseph glanced around the workshop, calculating how much more work the Cessna needed. The engine was nearly finished, and the few remaining tasks could wait until morning. Let me lock up here, and we'll go take a look. 20 minutes later, Joseph found himself following Richard's pickup truck across the darker section of the airport grounds, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk as they approached the row of abandoned hangars. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of winter's first serious storm. Hangar 5 loomed ahead of them, its massive doors secured with a heavy chain and padlock that looked like it had been there for decades. Richard parked near the smaller side entrance and climbed out of his truck, flashlight in hand and keys jingling in the cold air. "Haven't been inside here in probably 15 years, Richard said as he worked the old lock. "Used to use these hangars for equipment storage, but we moved everything closer to the main terminal when the new maintenance facility was built." The lock finally gave way with a rusty click, and Richard pushed open the heavy door. Stale air rushed out, carrying the musty smell of decades of dust and neglect. Joseph followed Richard inside, his own flashlight beam joining with his friends to illuminate the cavernous interior of the hangar. The space was larger than Joseph had expected, with a high ceiling supported by steel trusses and concrete floors that were cracked, but still solid. Along the walls, he could see the remnants of old workbenches and tool cabinets, evidence that this hangar had once been an active maintenance facility. But it was the shape in the back corner that captured Joseph's attention. Even covered by multiple layers of tarp and canvas, the outline was unmistakably that of an aircraft. The covering had been secured carefully, suggesting that whoever had stored the plane here had intended to return for it someday. "There she is," Richard said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Been sitting there like a sleeping giant for longer than I can remember." Joseph approached the covered aircraft slowly, his flashlight beam playing across the dusty canvas. The plane was smaller than a commercial aircraft, but larger than the typical general aviation planes he worked on regularly. As he moved around it, he could make out the distinctive shape of what appeared to be a single-engine design with sleek, streamlined lines that suggested it had been built for performance rather than utility. "Help me pull these covers off," Joseph said, his excitement growing despite his efforts to remain practical. Working together, the two men began removing the layers of protection that had kept the aircraft hidden for so many years. Dust rose in clouds as they pulled away the canvas, making them both cough and squint in the flashlight beams. When the last tarp fell away, Joseph stood in stunned silence, his flashlight beam revealing an aircraft unlike anything he had ever seen in person. The plane was beautiful, with clean lines and proportions that spoke of careful engineering and artistic design. The aluminum skin showed signs of age, but appeared to be in remarkably good condition, free of the corrosion that typically plagued aircraft left in storage for decades. "My God," Joseph whispered, moving closer to examine the cockpit. "This isn't just any experimental aircraft. Look at these design elements, the way the wings are integrated with the fuselage. This looks like it was built by someone who knew what they were doing." Richard joined him at the nose of the aircraft, running his flashlight beam along the engine cowling. "No manufacturer's markings that I can see. Whoever built this kept it quiet." Joseph climbed onto a nearby workbench to get a better look at the upper surfaces of the wings. The construction was immaculate, with flush riveting and attention to detail that rivaled anything he had seen from major aircraft manufacturers. This was clearly the work of a master craftsman, someone who had poured their heart and soul into creating something extraordinary. "Richard," Joseph said, his voice filled with awe, "I think we might have found something really special here. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The aroma of bacon and eggs filled the small kitchen of the Clark household as Joseph stood at the stove, spatula in hand, his mind still reeling from the previous night's discovery. Weak November sunlight filtered through gingham curtains that Grace had hung 5 years ago, illuminating a kitchen that bore the comfortable clutter of a family making do with what they had. Dishes were stacked neatly in a rack beside the sink, and school papers covered one corner of the round oak table that served as both dining room and homework station. Violet appeared in the doorway, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had probably belonged to Blake the year before. At 14, she possessed an unconscious grace that reminded Joseph painfully of her mother, but her hands already bore the small scars and calluses of someone who wasn't afraid of hard work. "Dad, you're burning the eggs," she said, moving to rescue breakfast before it became inedible. Joseph blinked and refocused on the pan, quickly sliding the eggs onto plates. "Sorry, honey, my mind was elsewhere." Blake stumbled into the kitchen. Moments later, his hair sticking up at odd angles and his shirt wrinkled from sleep. Where Violet moved with purpose, Blake approached the morning like a negotiation that hadn't yet been won. He collapsed into his usual chair at the table and reached for the orange juice without opening his eyes fully. "You look like you didn't sleep much," Violet observed, studying her father's face as he set plates before them. Joseph poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since 5 in the morning. "Richard and I found something interesting at the airport last night, an old aircraft that's been stored in one of the abandoned hangars." Blake's eyes opened wider, suddenly alert. "What kind of aircraft? Is it worth anything?" "That's what we need to find out," Joseph said, settling into his chair with his coffee. "It's experimental, probably from the late 40s. Beautiful craftsmanship, but I need to do some research to understand what we're dealing with." Violet leaned forward, her breakfast forgotten. "Can we see it? I mean, if it's just sitting there abandoned, maybe we could help you work on it." Joseph studied his daughter's eager expression, seeing the spark of curiosity that had been growing stronger each time she visited him at the shop. "It would be a big project, Violet. Restoration work takes months, sometimes years, and right now I'm not even sure I can afford to keep the shop open." The excitement in both teenagers' faces dimmed slightly at the reminder of their family's financial situation. Joseph immediately regretted his words, wishing he could shield them from the adult worries that seemed to intrude on every conversation lately. "What if the plane really is valuable?" Blake asked, his business-minded nature already working through possibilities. "Like, valuable enough to help us keep the shop?" "That's the hope," Joseph admitted. "But first I need to understand what it is and who might have built it. The construction is too sophisticated for a backyard builder. This was made by someone with serious engineering knowledge." Violet pushed eggs around her plate, deep in thought. "Could we help with the research? I mean, Blake's really good at finding information online, and I could help with the mechanical assessment." Joseph felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same pride he felt whenever his children showed their determination to tackle problems head-on. Grace had been the same way, never backing down from a challenge, never accepting defeat as final. "Tell. You what?" he said, reaching across the table to squeeze Violet's hand. "After school today, we'll drive over to the hangar and take a proper look. Then we can decide together whether this is something we want to pursue." The school day seemed to drag endlessly for both twins, their thoughts repeatedly returning to the mysterious aircraft waiting in Hangar 5. Violet found herself doodling airplane sketches in the margins of her history notes, while Blake spent his lunch period in the computer lab, researching experimental aircraft from the 1940s. At Hartwell High School, a brick building that had served the community since the 1960s, the Clark twins were known as good students who kept to themselves. They participated in enough activities to avoid being labeled antisocial, but their friends understood that they had responsibilities at home that other kids didn't share. Sophia Martinez, their favorite teacher, noticed their distraction during her afternoon English class. A young woman in her late 20s who had returned to her hometown after college to give back to the community. Sophia had developed a special fondness for the Clark twins. She understood the challenges of growing up in a single-parent household and made extra effort to provide encouragement and support. "Earth to Violet," Sophia said gently, as the class discussed themes in their current novel. "You seem a million miles away today." Violet blushed and straightened in her seat. "Sorry, Miss Martinez. Dad found something interesting at the airport, and I guess I'm excited to see it." "Oh, what kind of something?" "An old airplane that's been stored for decades. Dad thinks it might be valuable if we can restore it." Sophia's expression brightened. With genuine interest. "That sounds like an amazing project. Your father's really talented with mechanical work." The conversation was interrupted by the final bell, and students began gathering their books and bags. As Violet and Blake prepared to leave, Sophia called them over to her desk. "I don't know if this helps," she said, pulling a business card from her desk drawer, "but my cousin works at the State Historical Society in Pierre. If you need help researching the aircraft's background, she might be able to point you in the right direction." Blake took the card gratefully. "Thanks, Miss Martinez. That could be really useful." An hour later, the Clark family stood before Hangar 5 as Joseph worked the rusty lock that Richard had secured the night before. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete apron, and a cold wind whistled through the gaps in the hangar's metal siding. When the door swung open, both teenagers stepped inside with the reverence of people entering a cathedral. The aircraft sat in the filtered afternoon light, its aluminum skin gleaming despite the dust and neglect. In daylight, the plane's elegant lines were even more apparent, and both Violet and Blake stood speechless for several moments. "Wow," Violet whispered finally. "Dad, this is incredible." Blake circled the aircraft slowly, his business instincts already calculating possibilities. How much would something like this be worth if it were restored? "That depends on what it is and who built it," Joseph replied, opening a large toolbox he had brought from the shop. "First, we need to do a thorough inspection and see what we're working with." For the next 2 hours, the family systematically examined every visible inch of the aircraft. Joseph checked the engine compartment, finding a custom-built power plant that showed signs of sophisticated engineering. Violet crawled under the fuselage with a flashlight, calling out observations about the landing gear and control systems. Blake documented everything with his phone, taking detailed photographs that could be used for research later. The cockpit revealed the most intriguing clues. The instrument panel was a mixture of standard aviation equipment and custom gauges that suggested the aircraft had been designed for specific performance requirements. A small brass plate mounted below the throttle quadrant bore an inscription that made Joseph's breath catch in his throat. "Violet, Blake, come look at this," he called from the pilot's seat. Both teenagers crowded into the cockpit doorway as Joseph directed his flashlight at the brass plate. Engraved in elegant script were the words, "Built for the stars, grounded by love. CM 1947. CM," Blake repeated thoughtfully. Those could be the builder's initials. Violet leaned closer to examine the craftsmanship of the engraving. This wasn't just a hobby project. Someone put their heart into building this plane. Joseph nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with discovering something that had clearly meant everything to its creator. "We need to find out who CM was and why this aircraft was abandoned." As they prepared to leave the hangar, Joseph's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The display showed Stephen Bradley's name, and Joseph's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. Stephen was the manager at Community Bank, and calls from him never brought good news. "Joseph, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," Stephen's voice carried the forced friendliness of a man delivering an unwelcome message. "What can I do for you, Stephen?" I'm afraid I need to schedule a meeting with you about your accounts tomorrow afternoon, if possible. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding your loan status. Joseph closed his eyes, knowing exactly what Stephen wanted to discuss. The shop's account was overdrawn again, and the house payment was now 4 weeks late. I'll be there at 2 o'clock. When he hung up, both teenagers were watching him with worried expressions. Joseph forced a smile and began gathering his tools, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Just bank business," he said casually. "Nothing we can't handle." But as they drove home in gathering darkness, the weight of financial reality pressed down on Joseph's shoulders like a physical burden. The mysterious aircraft represented hope, but hope didn't pay immediate bills or buy groceries. Unless he could find a way to turn their discovery into quick cash, the Clark family's future remained as uncertain as ever. That evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Joseph sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his laptop, beginning the research that might determine whether their discovery was a blessing or simply another beautiful dream that reality wouldn't allow them to keep. His initial searches revealed tantalizingly little about experimental aircraft from 1947 with the initials CM. But as the hours passed and his coffee grew cold, Joseph began to piece together fragments of information that suggested their discovery might be more significant than he had dared to hope. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted his research. Violet appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing pajamas and fuzzy slippers, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Joseph looked at his daughter, seeing Grace's determination in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze. "I keep thinking about that aircraft. Something tells me it's important, but I can't shake the feeling that we're running out of time to find out what it really means." Violet leaned over to look at his laptop screen, which displayed a fuzzy photograph of what appeared to be a similar aircraft from an old aviation magazine. "Maybe running out of time is exactly why we found it now. Maybe some things come into our lives exactly when we need them most." Joseph reached over and squeezed his daughter's, and marveling at the wisdom that sometimes emerged from her 14-year-old perspective. "When did you get so smart?" "I had a good teacher," she replied with a smile that reminded him powerfully of Grace. "Dad, whatever happens with the bank tomorrow, we'll figure it out. We always do." As Joseph looked into his daughter's confident eyes, he felt a surge of determination that had been missing from his life for months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt like the Clark family had something worth fighting for. The meeting at Community Bank left Joseph feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Stephen. Bradley had been polite but firm. The Clark family had 30 days to bring their accounts current or face foreclosure proceedings on both the house and the shop. As Joseph walked across the town square toward Prairie Rose Diner, the November wind seemed to cut right through his jacket, matching the chill that had settled in his chest. Rose Sullivan looked up from wiping down tables as the bell above the diner door announced Joseph's arrival. At 62, Rose had the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent caring for others, and her eyes immediately recognized the defeated posture of a man carrying more weight than he could bear. "Coffee and pie?" she asked without preamble. Already reaching for the pot, Joseph slumped into his usual booth near the window, where he could see the airport in the distance. "Just coffee. I'm not sure I could keep anything else down right now." Rose poured the steaming liquid into a thick ceramic mug and settled into the seat across from him, her own cup cradled in weathered hands. The diner was empty, except for Walter Watson, the retired Air Force pilot who spent most afternoons nursing a single cup of coffee while reading aviation magazines. "Bank meeting?" Rose asked, with the directness of someone who had watched this. "Town's struggles for decades." Joseph nodded, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to problems that seemed insurmountable. 30 days. If I can't come up with $8,000 in 30 days, we lose everything. Rose's expression softened with sympathy, but her voice remained steady. That's not going to happen. This town doesn't abandon its own, Joseph Clark. We've been through worse. This is different, Rose. I can't ask people to bail me out of my own failures. From across the diner, Walter Watson's gravelly voice interrupted their conversation. Did I hear someone mention aviation troubles? The old pilot approached their table with the careful gait of a man whose knees had accumulated too many years, and too many hard landings. Walter had flown everything from crop dusters to military transports during his 40-year career, and his knowledge of aircraft was encyclopedic. Richard Morrison mentioned you found something interesting out at the airport, Walter continued, settling into the booth beside Rose. Mind if an old flyboy takes a look? Joseph found himself describing the mysterious aircraft, from its elegant lines to the cryptic inscription on the brass plate. As he spoke, Walter's expression grew increasingly thoughtful, and when Joseph mentioned the initials CM, the old pilot's eyes widened with recognition. CM, you said, from 1947. Walter leaned forward, his voice dropping to an almost whisper. Joseph, I think you might have found Charles Mansfield's lost prototype. The name meant nothing to Joseph, but Rose gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Charles Mansfield, the Charles Mansfield. Walter nodded grimly. One of the most brilliant aircraft designers of his generation, disappeared in 1947 while testing an experimental aircraft somewhere over the Midwest. They never found him or the plane. Joseph felt his pulse quicken. You're saying this could be the aircraft he was flying when he disappeared? Not the one he was flying, Walter corrected. The one he left behind. Mansfield was working on a series of experimental designs before his disappearance. If what you found matches the descriptions from the old aviation journals, it could be worth a fortune to collectors and museums. Rose's practical nature immediately asserted itself. Worth how much of a fortune? Walter stroked his chin thoughtfully. A genuine Mansfield prototype, properly authenticated, could be anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million, depending on condition and provenance. The numbers hit Joseph like a physical force, momentarily taking his breath away. $8,000 had seemed impossible an hour ago, but now they were discussing sums that could not only save his business, but transform his family's entire future. How would we go about authenticating something like that? Joseph asked, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. You'd need an expert in vintage aircraft. Someone with access to Mansfield's original design documents, Walter replied. Dr. John Mitchell at the Kansas Aviation Museum would be your best bet. He's written extensively about missing aircraft from that era. Joseph's mind was already racing with possibilities, but Rose's next question brought him back to earth with a thud. What happened to Charles Mansfield's family after he disappeared? Walter's expression grew somber. He left behind a young wife, pregnant with their second child, Helen Mansfield. She tried to continue his work for a while, but eventually moved to Chicago and started over. Built quite a business empire from what I hear, but never remarried. I imagine losing her husband that way left deep scars. The weight of this revelation settled over the table like a heavy blanket. They weren't just discussing an abandoned aircraft anymore, but a piece of someone's heartbreak, a remnant of a tragedy that had shattered a young family decades ago. If this really is Charles Mansfield's prototype, Joseph said slowly, then his widow might still be alive. She'd have a claim to it. Rose nodded approvingly. That's the right way to think about it, Joseph. Money's important, but doing right by people is more important. Later that afternoon, Joseph drove back to Hangar 5 with a borrowed digital camera and a notebook, determined to document everything about the aircraft that might help with authentication. The wind had died down, leaving the November air crisp and still, perfect for the detailed photography he needed to undertake. As he worked methodically around the aircraft, taking pictures of every rivet, every surface, every detail that might prove significant, Joseph found himself thinking about Charles Mansfield and the passion that had driven him to create something so beautiful. The craftsmanship was evident in every joint, every curve, every carefully considered design element. The engine compartment revealed custom modifications that spoke of innovative thinking decades ahead of its time. Lightweight components, experimental alloys, and aerodynamic refinements that wouldn't become standard in aviation for another 20 years. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a glimpse into the future as one brilliant mind had envisioned it in 1947. Joseph was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear footsteps approaching until a familiar voice called out behind him. "Finding anything interesting?" He turned to see Anthony Harrington standing in the hangar doorway, his expensive overcoat and polished shoes looking distinctly out of place in the dusty industrial setting. The developer's presence here was unexpected and unwelcome, like finding a snake in a garden. "Anthony," Joseph said carefully, not moving away from the aircraft, "what brings you to this part of the airport?" Harrington stepped further into the hangar, his cold eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. "Richard Morrison mentioned that you'd found some old junk out here. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about." The dismissive tone in Harrington's voice set Joseph's teeth on edge, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Just an old aircraft that's been stored here for decades. Nothing that would interest you." "Actually, everything on this airport property interests me, Joseph. I've made the town council a very generous offer for the entire facility. This hangar and whatever's in it would be part of that deal." Joseph felt ice form in his stomach. "The airport's not for sale." Harrington smiled, the predatory smile of a man who held all the cards and knew it. "Everything's for sale at the right price. The town needs revenue, and my development project would generate more tax income in 1 year than this little airport has produced in its entire existence." "This airport serves an important function in the community," Joseph said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "There are people here who depend on it for their livelihoods. People like you?" Harrington's smile widened. "I heard about your meeting with Stephen Bradley today. 30 days to come up with $8,000, wasn't it? That's unfortunate timing, especially when you're wasting time on worthless antiques instead of focusing on real solutions." The fact that Harrington already knew about the bank meeting confirmed Joseph's suspicions about how information traveled in a small town, especially when money and influence were involved. He set down his camera and stepped closer to the developer, his hands clenched at his sides. "My financial situation is none of your business, Anthony. Actually, it is my business. When you inevitably default on your loans, your shop will go up for auction. I'll be there to make sure it's purchased by someone who understands its real value as commercial real estate." Joseph's vision seemed to narrow to a tunnel, focused entirely on Harrington's smug face. "You're not getting my shop, or this airport, or this aircraft," Harrington laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the cold air. "Joseph, you're a dreamer. That pile of aluminum isn't going to save you. Even if it were worth something, which I doubt, you don't have the resources to restore it or the contacts to sell it. You're going to lose everything anyway, so why not make it easy on yourself?" "Because some things are worth fighting for," Joseph replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. Harrington studied Joseph's face for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something in the mechanic's expression that hadn't been there during their previous encounters. When he spoke again, his tone carried a subtle threat. "Fighting is expensive, Joseph. Make sure you can afford the cost." After Harrington left, Joseph stood alone in the hangar with the mysterious aircraft, feeling like he was standing at a crossroads that would determine not just his family's future, but the future of everything he valued about his community. The developer's visit had made one thing crystal clear: time was running out, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. But as Joseph looked at the elegant lines of Charles Mansfield's creation, he felt something he hadn't experienced. in months. A sense of purpose that went beyond simple survival. This aircraft represented more than just a potential solution to his financial problems. It was a connection to someone who had dared to dream of flying higher and faster than anyone before him. Someone who had poured his heart into creating something beautiful and lasting. If Charles Mansfield could chase impossible dreams in 1947, then maybe Joseph Clark could find a way to save everything that mattered in Hartwell, South Dakota. In the present day, the Kansas Aviation Museum in Wichita buzzed with quiet activity as Dr. John Mitchell examined the high-resolution photographs Joseph had spread across his desk. The historian's office was a treasure trove of aviation memorabilia, with vintage propellers mounted on walls beside framed photographs of legendary aircraft and their pilots. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above stacks of research materials. Dr. Mitchell adjusted his reading glasses and picked up another photograph, studying it with the intensity of a detective examining crucial evidence. At 63, he possessed the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades piecing together aviation mysteries, but Joseph could see excitement building behind his scholarly composure. "These engine modifications are remarkable," Dr. Mitchell murmured, pointing to a detailed shot of the power plant. Mansfield was experimenting with fuel injection systems 20 years before they became standard. And look at these wing root fairings. The aerodynamic efficiency would have been extraordinary for 1947. Joseph leaned forward in his chair, trying to read the expert's expression. "So you think it's authentic?" Dr. Mitchell set down the photograph and turned to a thick file cabinet behind his desk. After a moment of searching, he withdrew a manila folder marked with faded typewriter labels. Inside were photocopies of technical drawings and handwritten notes, yellowed with age but still legible. "These are copies of Charles Mansfield's design notes from the family estate," Dr. Mitchell explained, spreading the documents beside Joseph's photographs. "His widow donated them to the Smithsonian in 1962, but I obtained copies for my research." The comparison was immediately striking. Details from the photographs matched precisely with elements shown in Mansfield's sketches. The distinctive engine cowling, the unique wing strut configuration, even the placement of inspection panels on the fuselage. Joseph felt his heart rate increase as the evidence mounted. "The serial number would be the final proof," Dr. Mitchell said, consulting a handwritten list. "According to these notes, the prototype should have CM47001 engraved somewhere on the main engine mount." Joseph pulled out his phone and scrolled through dozens of photographs until he found the image he was looking for. The engraving was barely visible beneath decades of grime, but the numbers were unmistakable. CM47001. Dr. Mitchell removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that seemed to convey the weight of historical significance. "Joseph, what you found is aviation history. Charles Mansfield was working on designs that wouldn't be fully understood or implemented for decades. This aircraft represents a quantum leap in 1940s technology." "What happened to him?" Walter Watson mentioned he disappeared while testing an aircraft. Dr. Mitchell's expression grew solemn as he consulted another file. October 15th, 1947, Mansfield took off from a private airfield in Kansas in a different prototype, one he'd been working on for the military. Weather was deteriorating, but he was determined to complete a high-altitude performance test. Radio contact was lost somewhere over the Colorado Rockies. Neither he nor the aircraft were ever found. Joseph studied a faded photograph of Charles Mansfield standing beside an aircraft that looked similar to the one hidden in Hangar 5. The man in the picture appeared to be in his early 30s, with the confident posture of someone who believed he could conquer the sky through sheer force of will and engineering brilliance. He left behind a wife and young daughter. Helen was 24 when he disappeared, pregnant with their second child. She tried to continue his work at first, but the grief and financial pressures were overwhelming. She eventually sold the company assets and moved to Chicago with her children. Dr. Mitchell opened another folder, this one containing more recent newspaper clippings and magazine articles. Helen Mansfield built a remarkable life after tragedy struck. Started with a small manufacturing company and grew it into a multi-billion-dollar empire. She's now one of the wealthiest women in America, but she's never forgotten her first husband's legacy. Joseph felt the ethical weight of the situation settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. She should know about this aircraft. It rightfully belongs to her. That's admirable thinking, but legally, the situation is complex. The aircraft was presumably abandoned when Mansfield disappeared. After 75 years, ownership could be claimed through adverse possession, depending on state laws. But you're right about the moral obligation. Dr. Mitchell stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the museum's restoration hangar, where volunteers worked on vintage aircraft. There's something else you should know about Helen Mansfield. She spent considerable resources over the years searching for any trace of her husband's work. She's funded archaeological expeditions, hired private investigators, even sponsored university research projects. Finding this prototype would mean everything to her. The drive back to Hartwell gave Joseph time to process everything he had learned. The aircraft in Hangar 5 wasn't just valuable. It was a piece of someone's heart, a tangible connection to a love story that had been interrupted by tragedy 75 years ago. The ethical implications were clear, but the practical problems remained overwhelming. That evening, the Clark family gathered around the kitchen table with Chinese takeout containers and legal pads, planning their next moves like generals preparing for a campaign. Blake had printed out research materials about aircraft restoration costs, while Violet had sketched preliminary diagrams of the work that would need to be done. Even if we contact Helen Mansfield directly, Blake said, consulting his notes, restoration could take 6 months to a year. We don't have that kind of time. Violet looked up from her sketches, her pencil poised thoughtfully. What if we don't restore it completely? What if we just get it to a condition where an expert can properly evaluate it? Joseph considered his daughter's suggestion. That's not a bad idea. Focus on making it safe to move and ensuring all the critical components are intact. That might be enough to interest serious collectors or museums. How much would partial restoration cost? Blake asked, ever practical. Joseph did quick calculations in his head, considering materials, specialized tools, and the time investment required. Maybe $3,000 in parts and supplies, assuming I do all the labor myself. The bigger challenge is workspace. We'd need to move it from the hangar to a proper workshop. Could we move it to your shop? Violet asked. Not without major modifications. The doors aren't wide enough, and we'd need to partially disassemble it. That's risky with an aircraft this old and valuable. Blake tapped his pencil against his notepad, his expression indicating an idea was forming. What about asking Richard Morrison to let us use Hangar 5 as a temporary workshop? If the airport authority owns it anyway, maybe they'd rent it to us. For the restoration work, Joseph felt a spark of excitement at his son's suggestion. That could actually work. Richard's been supportive so far, and the hangar already has electrical connections. We'd need to install some equipment, but it's definitely possible. The sound of car doors slamming outside interrupted their planning session. Through the kitchen window, Joseph could see Mayor Christine Hayes approaching the front door, accompanied by Betty Williams from the town council. Both women wore expressions that suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Mr. Clark," Mayor Hayes called through the screen door, "could we speak with you for a few minutes?" Joseph invited the women into the living room, offering coffee that they politely declined. Mayor Hayes was a practical woman in her mid-50s who had served the community faithfully for 8 years. But tonight, She looked uncomfortable in a way that made Joseph's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Joseph, we've had some difficult conversations at the town council meeting tonight," Mayor Hayes began carefully. "Anthony Harrington has presented us with a formal development proposal. That's hard to ignore." Betty Williams, who had known Joseph since he was a child, spoke up with obvious reluctance. "He's offering to buy the entire airport property for $4 million. The revenue would eliminate our budget deficit and fund infrastructure improvements. For the next decade." Joseph felt the blood drain from his face. "You're seriously considering selling the airport?" "We don't want to," Mayor Hayes replied. "But we have to consider what's best for the entire community. The airport currently generates minimal revenue, and maintaining it costs the town nearly $100,000 annually. That airport is part of this town's heritage," Joseph said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "My father worked on aircraft there during the Korean War. Richard Morrison has dedicated his life to keeping it operational. You can't just sell it to a developer who wants to turn it into strip malls." Betty Williams reached across to pat Joseph's hand sympathetically. "We know how much it means to you and your family. That's why we wanted to talk to you before making any final decisions. Harrington's offer includes provisions for relocating your shop to a new facility on the outskirts of town." "I don't want a new facility. I want to stay where I am, doing work that matters." Mayor Hayes exchanged glances with Betty Williams before continuing. "There's something else. Harrington mentioned that you've been spending time in the old hangars recently. He's concerned about liability issues if people are accessing abandoned buildings without proper authorization." The implication was clear. Joseph's research into the mysterious aircraft had somehow reached Harrington's attention, and the developer was using it as additional leverage against the airport. Joseph realized that their discovery, which had seemed like salvation just days ago, was now being weaponized against them. "How long do we have?" Joseph asked quietly. "The council will vote next Wednesday," Mayor Hayes replied. "That gives us 6 days to consider alternatives. If there was some way the airport could become self-sustaining, or if it had historical significance that made it worth preserving." Joseph heard the hint in her voice and felt a surge of hope. "What if I told you there might be something historically significant in one of those hangars? Something that could change the entire value proposition of the airport?" Both women leaned forward with interest, and Joseph found himself describing the Charles Mansfield prototype, though he was careful not to reveal details that might compromise their position if word reached Harrington. "If this aircraft is as valuable as you think," Mayor Hayes said thoughtfully, "it could certainly impact our decision, but we'd need expert verification and a clear plan for how it would benefit the community." After the women left, Joseph sat in his darkened living room, staring out at the lights of the airport in the distance. 6 days to save everything he cared about. 6 days to prove that some things were worth more than money, that heritage and community had value that couldn't be measured in development dollars. Tomorrow, he would begin the most important restoration, a project of his life, not just rebuilding an aircraft, but rebuilding hope for an entire community's future. Dawn came grey and cold to Hartwell as Joseph stood in the doorway of Hangar 5, surveying the workspace that would either save his community or become the site of his final defeat. Richard Morrison had agreed to rent the hangar for restoration work, waiving the usual fees in exchange for Joseph's promise to document everything for the airport's historical records. 4 days remained until the town council vote. The hangar's interior had been transformed overnight with borrowed equipment from the aviation repair shop. Extension cords snaked across the concrete floor, powering work lights that banished the shadows from every corner. A portable air compressor hummed quietly beside workbenches that Joseph had assembled from sawhorses and plywood, while tool chests stood ready like soldiers awaiting orders. Violet emerged from beneath the aircraft's wing, her face streaked with decades-old grease, but glowing with excitement. She had volunteered to clean and inspect the undercarriage components, a job that required crawling into spaces barely large enough for a teenage girl. "Dad, you need to see this," she called, beckoning him over with a grease-stained hand. "The landing gear mechanism is incredible. Look at these machined components. They're like jewelry." Joseph knelt beside his daughter and followed her flashlight beam to examine the retraction system. Each piece had been crafted with obsessive attention to detail, from the perfectly balanced hinges to the hydraulic cylinders that still held pressure after 75 years. Charles Mansfield hadn't just built an aircraft. He had created a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. Blake appeared in the hangar doorway carrying a thermos of coffee and a stack of printouts, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "I've been researching Helen Mansfield," he announced, settling his materials on the makeshift workbench. "She owns Mansfield Industries, headquartered in Chicago. They manufacture precision aerospace components for NASA and private space companies." Joseph accepted the coffee gratefully, warming his hands around the metal cup. "Any contact information?" "That's the problem. She's intensely private, especially about anything related to her first husband. I found some old interviews where she mentioned Charles, but nothing recent. Her company has layers of assistants and security people." Violet slid out from under the aircraft, wiping her hands on a shop rag. "What if we contacted Dr. Mitchell again? He seems to know a lot about her." "Search for Charles's work." "Already tried," Blake replied, consulting his notes. "He's willing to help, but he warned me that Helen Mansfield has been approached by fraudsters before. People claiming to have found Charles's aircraft or personal effects, usually trying to scam money from her. She's very skeptical of unsolicited contact." The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted their discussion. Through the hangar's open doorway, Joseph watched a sleek black sedan pull up beside Richard Morrison's pickup truck. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the driver's seat, followed by Anthony Harrington from the passenger side. "Trouble," Joseph muttered, instinctively moving to position himself between the visitors and the aircraft. Harrington strode into the hangar with the confidence of someone who believed he owned everything he surveyed. His companion was younger, perhaps in his mid-20s, with the soft features of someone who had never worked with his hands, but possessed the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating assets. "Joseph," Harrington said with false friendliness, "I'd like you to meet my son David. He's been helping me assess the development potential of this property." David Harrington stepped forward, extending a hand that Joseph reluctantly shook. Unlike his father, the younger man seemed genuinely interested in the aircraft, walking around it with obvious curiosity rather than dismissive calculation. "This is remarkable craftsmanship," David said, running his fingers along the wing's leading edge. "The metalwork is extraordinary, and these design elements are decades ahead of their time." Anthony Harrington's expression darkened at his son's obvious appreciation. "It's a pile of scrap metal that's been rotting in here for decades. The real value is in the land underneath it." "Actually, Dad, I think you're wrong about this," David replied with quiet determination. "If this is what I think it is, we're looking at a genuine piece of aviation history." Joseph studied the younger Harrington with surprise, recognizing something unexpected in his demeanor. Unlike his father's predatory acquisitiveness, David seemed to possess genuine respect for craftsmanship and historical significance. "What do you think it is?" Violet asked, her natural curiosity overriding her family's antagonism toward the Harrington name. David pulled out his smartphone and showed them a photograph he had apparently downloaded. "Charles Mansfield's experimental prototype. I wrote my college thesis on missing aircraft from the post-war period. This matches every description I've ever read." Anthony Harrington's face flushed with anger. "David, we're not here to play aviation. Historian, we're here to assess commercial development potential." But this changes everything, David insisted, turning back to Joseph. An authenticated Mansfield prototype would make this hangar more valuable as a museum than as a parking lot for a shopping center. The tension between father and son was palpable, and Joseph found himself in the unexpected position of watching a family drama unfold that might determine his own family's fate. Anthony Harrington had clearly expected his son to support the development project without question, but David's expertise had led him to very different conclusions. "Museums don't generate revenue," Anthony said coldly. "They consume it. A town needs jobs and tax income, not dusty displays that attract a handful of tourists." David turned to face his father directly, his voice carrying newfound authority. "What about heritage tourism? Aviation enthusiasts travel thousands of miles to see aircraft like this. A properly marketed museum could generate more sustainable revenue than any strip mall." Joseph felt a surge of hope as he realized that an unexpected ally had appeared from the most unlikely source. But Anthony Harrington wasn't finished with his arguments. "Even if this heap of metal is historically significant," Anthony said, gesturing dismissively at the aircraft, "Clark doesn't have the resources to restore it or the expertise to authenticate it. He's going to lose his business in 3 days. Anyway." The reminder hit Joseph like a physical blow. In his excitement over the restoration work, he had temporarily forgotten about his meeting with Stephen Bradley and the bank's ultimatum. 3 days to come up with $8,000, or everything would be lost regardless of what they discovered about the aircraft. Blake stepped forward, his business-minded nature asserting itself. "What if we could prove authentication and secure funding for restoration? Would that change the development timeline?" Anthony Harrington laughed harshly. "Your children playing with adult problems. Banking doesn't work on wishful thinking about antique airplanes." But David Harrington was studying Blake with obvious interest. "Actually, there are grant programs specifically for aviation heritage preservation. The Smithsonian has emergency funding for historically significant discoveries, and there are private foundations that support this kind of work." Joseph felt his heart racing as possibilities multiplied in his mind. How quickly could something like that be processed? Emergency grants can sometimes be approved in 48 hours if the documentation is compelling enough, David replied. "But you'd need expert authentication and a detailed preservation plan." Anthony Harrington's expression had grown increasingly thunderous as the conversation progressed. "David, we're leaving. This discussion is pointless." But David stood his ground with quiet determination. "I'm staying, Dad. This is too important to walk away from." The confrontation between father and son reached a breaking point as Anthony Harrington realized he was losing control of both the situation and his heir. "If you stay here chasing fantasies instead of focusing on real business, don't expect to inherit anything worth having." David's response was calm but final. "Some things are worth more than money, Dad. I thought you taught me that, but I guess I learned it somewhere else." After Anthony Harrington stormed out of the hangar, the remaining group stood in awkward silence for several moments. David seemed smaller somehow, without his father's imposing presence, but also more genuine, as if removing a mask he had been forced to wear. "I'm sorry about that," David said quietly. "He's not always like that. This development project has become an obsession for him." Violet, who had been watching the family drama with fascination, spoke up with characteristic directness. "Why is it so important to him?" David considered the question carefully before answering. "He thinks this is his chance to leave a lasting legacy, build something permanent that will outlive him. He doesn't understand that some things already have that kind of permanence." Joseph found himself warming to this unexpected ally, recognizing something of his own passion for preservation in the young man's words. "Would you really be willing to help us pursue grant funding?" "I'd be honored to help," David replied, "but we need to move fast. If the town council votes to sell the airport, even emergency grants won't matter." Blake consulted his watch, his face grim with calculation. "We have 72 hours until the vote. Even if we get Dr. Mitchell to provide written authentication today, submitting grant applications and getting responses seems impossible." David pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts. "I know people at several foundations, personal connections from my thesis research. If we can get proper documentation together, I might be able to expedite the process." As the group began planning their desperate race against time, Joseph felt something he hadn't experienced since Grace's death: the warmth of community support from an unexpected quarter. Sometimes the most unlikely alliances formed in the face of shared challenges, and sometimes the children of adversaries chose different paths than their parents. But even with David's help, the clock was ticking relentlessly toward Wednesday's vote, and $8,000 in immediate debt still stood between the Clark family and any chance of seeing their restoration dreams become reality. The emergency meeting at Prairie Rose Diner resembled a war council more than a casual gathering. Dr. John Mitchell had driven 3 hours from Wichita with a briefcase full of authentication documents, while David Harrington sat across from him with a laptop displaying grant application forms. Joseph paced nervously behind them, acutely aware that 48 hours remained until the town council vote. Rose Sullivan kept their coffee cups filled and the diner's front door locked, having posted a "closed for private event" sign to ensure their privacy. The weight of the moment was evident in everyone's posture, back straight, voices hushed, every gesture carrying the urgency of people fighting against an immovable deadline. The Smithsonian Emergency Heritage Fund requires 3 expert validations, Dr. Mitchell explained, spreading official letterhead across the table. "We can provide 1 based on my examination of the photographs and comparison with original design documents. We need 2 more from recognized authorities." David scrolled through contacts on his laptop screen, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Professor Alan Burke at the University of Kansas specializes in experimental aircraft. He might be willing to provide written authentication based on detailed photographs. "What about the 3rd validation?" Blake asked, consulting notes he had made during their planning session. "There's a vintage aircraft appraiser in Denver who's worked with the Smithsonian before," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Thomas Reed. He's expensive, but his authentication carries significant weight with grant committees." Joseph stopped pacing and leaned against the diner's counter, calculating costs that seemed to multiply every time they found a solution to one problem. "How expensive?" $5,000 for emergency authentication services, Dr. Mitchell said apologetically. "Plus travel expenses to examine the aircraft in person." The number hit Joseph like cold water. $5,000 might as well have been $5 million, given his current financial situation. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He needed money to prove the aircraft was valuable enough to generate the money he needed. Violet looked up from sketches she'd been making of the aircraft's unique features. "What if we brought the aircraft to him instead of paying him to come here?" "Too risky," Dr. Mitchell replied immediately. "Moving an unrestored vintage aircraft could cause irreparable damage. Besides, we'd need special permits and transportation. Equipment." David's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and he glanced at the display before answering. "Professor Burke, thank you for calling back so quickly." The conversation that followed was conducted in technical language that demonstrated David's genuine expertise in aviation history. Joseph found himself reassessing his assumptions about the young man, recognizing that his knowledge went far deeper than casual academic interest. "He'll provide written authentication if we can send him high-resolution photographs of specific components," David reported after ending the call. "Particularly the engine serial numbers and wing construction." Details. Blake consulted his watch with obvious anxiety. We're burning daylight. If we're going to get professional photographs done and submitted, we need to move now. The group relocated to Hangar 5, where afternoon sunlight streamed through high windows, providing natural illumination for the detailed photography they needed. Dr. Mitchell directed the process with scientific precision, calling out specific angles and measurements, while Violet positioned lights and Blake documented everything with military-like organization. Joseph found himself marveling at how his children had risen to meet this challenge. Violet's mechanical intuition guided her understanding of which components were most significant, while Blake's systematic approach ensured nothing important was overlooked. Grace would have been proud of how they had grown into their responsibilities. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their work. Through the hangar doorway, Joseph watched 3 cars pull up outside, Mayor Christine Hayes leading a small convoy that included Betty Williams and 2 other town council members. Their expressions suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Mr. Clark," Mayor Hayes called as she approached the hangar entrance, "we need to discuss some developments regarding Wednesday's vote." Joseph wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, leaving the others to continue their photographic work. The November wind carried the scent of snow, and dark clouds were building on the western horizon. "What kind of developments?" Joseph asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Betty Williams spoke up with obvious reluctance. "Anthony Harrington has accelerated his timeline. He's demanding a special council session tomorrow evening instead of Wednesday. He claims there are time-sensitive financing issues with his development project." Joseph felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. 24 hours instead of 48. Their already impossible deadline had just become catastrophic. "Can he do that legally?" "Unfortunately, yes," Mayor Hayes replied. "He's within his rights to request emergency sessions for matters of significant financial impact to the community." "This is about more than financing," Joseph said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He knows we're close to proving this. Aircraft's historical significance. He's trying to force a vote before we can present our evidence." Mayor Hayes nodded grimly. "That's what we suspected, which is why we're here. If you have something concrete to present, we need to see it now. The council members are under enormous pressure to accept Harrington's offer." Joseph glanced back at the hangar, where Dr. Mitchell was examining the aircraft's propeller with intense concentration. "Dr. Mitchell is preparing formal authentication documents. We're also pursuing emergency grant funding that could make the airport financially viable." "How much grant funding?" asked Councilman Robert Patterson, a practical man who understood that good intentions didn't balance municipal budgets. David Harrington appeared in the hangar doorway, laptop in hand and determination written across his face. "The Smithsonian Emergency Heritage Fund provides up to $200,000 for significant discoveries. The National Aviation Foundation can match that amount for preservation projects." The council members exchanged glances that indicated serious interest. $400,000 in grant funding would transform the airport from a financial burden into a revenue-generating asset. "What's required to secure those grants?" Mayor Hayes asked. "Expert authentication, detailed preservation plans, and community support documentation," David replied. "We're working on all 3 components." Betty Williams studied David with curiosity. "Aren't you Anthony Harrington's son?" "I am," David acknowledged. "But I believe this aircraft represents something more valuable than any commercial development. Some legacies are worth preserving regardless of immediate profit." Joseph watched the council members process this unexpected development. The sight of Anthony Harrington's own son advocating against his father's project carried symbolic weight that couldn't be ignored. "There's something else you should know," Mayor Hayes said. her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "We received a call this afternoon from someone claiming to represent Helen Mansfield's interests. They're sending a representative to evaluate the aircraft tomorrow morning." The announcement sent a jolt of electricity through everyone present. Joseph felt his heart rate accelerate as the implications became clear. Somehow, word of their discovery had reached the one person who had the strongest claim to Charles Mansfield's prototype. "How did they find out about it?" Joseph asked. Dr. Mitchell emerged from the hangar, having overheard the conversation. "I may have mentioned it to a colleague at the Smithsonian during my authentication research. Academic networks are smaller than people realize." David frowned with obvious concern. "If Helen Mansfield's people are coming tomorrow and the council votes tomorrow night, we're looking at a perfect storm of competing interests." Joseph felt the walls closing in around him. Helen Mansfield had every moral and potentially legal right to claim the aircraft. If she exercised that right, all their restoration dreams and grant applications would become meaningless. The Clark family would lose both their salvation and their home. "What time is this representative arriving?" Blake asked, his business instincts already calculating logistics. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mayor Hayes replied. "They're flying into the regional airport in a private aircraft." Violet stepped out of the hangar, grease stains on her clothes but excitement in her eyes. Maybe this is good news. If Helen Mansfield is as wealthy as everyone says, she might be willing to help preserve the aircraft and support the community. Or she might simply reclaim her property and move it to a private collection where it disappears from public view, David countered. "Wealthy collectors don't always share academic interests in historical preservation." Joseph stared at the aircraft visible through the hangar doorway, its elegant lines representing either salvation or heartbreak, depending on decisions that would be made by people he had never met. 75 years after Charles Mansfield's disappearance, his widow was finally coming home to claim what remained of their shared dreams. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions that had haunted multiple families for decades. But whether those answers would save or destroy the Clark family's future remained as uncertain as the weather gathering on the horizon. As the officials departed and darkness settled over Hangar 5, Joseph found himself standing alone with the aircraft that had become the center of his universe. Whatever happened tomorrow, he knew that his life had been permanently changed by discovering this sleeping giant. Sometimes the most important journeys began with a single step into the unknown, and sometimes the destination was nothing like what you had imagined when the journey started. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his contemplation. Richard Morrison appeared in the hangar doorway, his weathered face showing the strain of a man watching his life's work threatened by forces beyond his control. "Heard about tomorrow's developments," Richard said, settling onto a workbench with obvious fatigue. "Feels like we're about to witness the end of an era." Joseph nodded, understanding the weight behind his friend's words. "Maybe, or maybe we're about to discover that some stories have better endings than we expected." "You really think Helen Mansfield might help preserve this place?" Joseph touched the aircraft's wing, feeling the smooth aluminum beneath his palm. "I think she's been searching for this airplane for 75 years. When she finds it tomorrow, she's going to remember what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. Maybe that memory will help her understand what this community is facing." Richard smiled for the first time in days. "Grace would have been proud of how you're handling this. She always said you were stronger than you knew." As the two men stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the tools and dreams of 3 generations of aviation enthusiasts, Joseph felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight, Charles Mansfield's prototype was exactly where it belonged, surrounded by people who understood the value of craftsmanship, community, and never giving up on impossible dreams. The sleek corporate jet touched down at Hartwell Regional Airport precisely at 10 o'clock, its pristine white fuselage gleaming in the morning sunlight. Joseph stood beside Hangar 5 with Violet and Blake, watching the aircraft taxi toward the terminal building with the smooth efficiency of wealth and careful planning. His palms were sweating despite the November cold, and his mouth felt dry as desert sand. Richard Morrison emerged from the terminal building, walking beside a woman who commanded attention without trying. Amanda Foster appeared to be in her early 40s, dressed in a charcoal business suit that managed to look both professional and practical. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Quickly, Mr. Clark," Amanda said, extending a firm handshake as introductions were made. "I'm Amanda Foster, representing Mrs. Helen Mansfield's interests. I understand you've made a remarkable discovery." Joseph led the group toward the hangar, his heart pounding with each step. "We believe we've found Charles Mansfield's experimental prototype from 1947. Dr. Mitchell from the Kansas Aviation Museum has provided preliminary authentication." Amanda's expression remained professionally neutral, but Joseph caught a flicker of something deeper in her eyes, anticipation perhaps, or carefully controlled emotion. Mrs. Mansfield has been searching for any trace of her husband's work for most of her adult life. This represents more than historical curiosity for her. Hangar doors swung open to reveal the aircraft, bathed in carefully positioned work lights. Amanda stepped inside and stopped abruptly, her composed demeanor cracking for just a moment. She approached the prototype slowly, her hand rising unconsciously to touch a small pendant at her throat. "My God," she whispered, her voice carrying decades of suppressed emotion. "It's exactly as she described it." Violet stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had spent days becoming intimately familiar with every rivet and wire. "Would you like me to show you the specific features that confirm its authenticity?" Amanda nodded, following Violet as she pointed out the custom engine modifications, the unique wing construction, and finally the brass plate with its inscription, "Built for the stars, grounded by love, CM 1947. Charles wrote those words in a letter to Helen just before his final flight, Amanda said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's kept that letter for 75 years. Blake consulted his notebook, his business instincts recognizing an opportunity for positive negotiation. "Mrs. Foster, we understand that Mrs. Mansfield has rightful claim to this aircraft, but we're hoping there might be a way for everyone's interests to align." Amanda turned from the aircraft to study Blake with obvious interest. "What did you have in mind?" Joseph took a deep breath and launched into the explanation they had rehearsed. Throughout the sleepless night, this aircraft could become the centerpiece of an aviation heritage center here at the airport. Mrs. Mansfield would retain ownership, but the prototype would be preserved and displayed where aviation enthusiasts from around the world could appreciate Charles's genius. The community is facing financial pressures that threaten the airport's existence, David Harrington added, having arrived quietly during the presentation. Heritage tourism could provide sustainable revenue while honoring both Charles Mansfield's legacy and the town's aviation history. Amanda walked slowly around the aircraft, her trained eye cataloging details that spoke to both its historical significance and current condition. "What kind of timeline are we discussing for restoration and display preparation?" Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with a folder of technical assessments. "With proper funding and expertise, we could have it ready for public display within 6 months. The structural integrity is remarkable for an aircraft of this age." "Mrs. Mansfield doesn't make decisions lightly," Amanda replied carefully. "She's been disappointed by false hopes before, But I can tell you that preserving Charles's legacy has been her life's work since his disappearance. The sound of car engines outside interrupted their conversation. Through the hangar doorway, Joseph watched Mayor Hayes arrive with the complete town council, their faces grim with the weight of the decision they would make that evening. Behind them, Anthony Harrington's black sedan pulled up, its occupant emerging with the predatory smile of someone who believed victory was assured. "Mr. Clark," Mayor Hayes called as she approached the hangar. "I hope you don't mind, but we felt the council should see this aircraft before tonight's vote." Anthony Harrington pushed past the council members with obvious irritation. "This is a waste of time. We're here to discuss real estate development, not to gawk at museum pieces." Amanda Foster turned to face Harrington with the cool assessment of someone accustomed to dealing with aggressive business tactics. "Mr. Harrington, I presume?" "I'm Amanda Foster, representing Helen Mansfield's interests in this matter." The developer's expression shifted as he recognized the name, his confidence wavering for the first time since Joseph had known him. Helen Mansfield's reputation preceded her even in small-town South Dakota, and Anthony Harrington was clearly recalculating his position. "Mrs. Mansfield is naturally interested in any discovery related to her late husband," Amanda continued smoothly. "She's particularly supportive of efforts to preserve aviation history for future generations." Mayor Hayes stepped forward with obvious interest. "Ms. Foster, could you help us understand Mrs. Mansfield's intentions regarding this aircraft?" Amanda consulted her phone briefly before responding. "I'm authorized to make a preliminary offer on Mrs. Mansfield's behalf. She would be willing to fund complete restoration of the aircraft and establishment of a permanent aviation heritage center, contingent on the community's commitment to maintaining the airport as a historical site." The numbers Amanda outlined made several council members gasp audibly. $2 million for restoration and facility construction, plus an endowment fund that would ensure the center's operation in perpetuity. The economic impact would transform Hartwell from a struggling agricultural community into a destination for aviation tourism. Anthony Harrington's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is fantasy economics. Tourism revenue is unpredictable, seasonal, dependent on factors no one can control. Unlike strip mall revenue," David Harrington asked quietly, his question carrying years of suppressed disagreement with his father's development philosophy. "Don't lecture me about economics, David. I've built more successful projects than you've. Had college courses, but you've never built anything that people will remember with pride 50 years from now," David replied with sad certainty. This could be different. Amanda watched the family confrontation with professional interest before addressing the council directly. "Mrs. Mansfield's offer comes with certain conditions. The aircraft must remain on permanent public display. The facility must meet specific historical preservation standards, and the community must demonstrate long-term commitment to aviation heritage." Betty Williams spoke up with practical concern. "What about immediate financial relief? The town has budget shortfalls that need addressing now." "Mrs. Mansfield understands the urgency," Amanda replied. "She's prepared to provide bridge funding to address immediate municipal needs while the Heritage Center is being developed." Joseph felt hope rising in his chest like helium in a balloon. Everything they had dreamed of seemed within reach. The aircraft preserved, the airport saved, the community's future secured through sustainable heritage tourism rather than destructive commercial development. But Anthony Harrington wasn't finished fighting. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're being offered fairy tales by people who don't understand real-world business. Mrs. Mansfield's proposal requires years of complex development with no guarantee of success. My offer provides immediate cash that solves your problems today." Your offer also destroys everything that makes this community worth preserving, Richard Morrison interjected with quiet passion. Some things shouldn't be measured only in dollars, Mayor. Hayes looked around the hangar, her eyes taking in the aircraft, the passionate faces of the preservationists, and the frustrated expression of the developer who had seemed so confident just hours earlier. Ms. Foster, how quickly could Mrs. Mansfield's commitments be formalized? I can have preliminary agreements drafted and signed within 48 hours, Amanda replied. Mrs. Mansfield has been waiting 75 years for this moment. She won't let bureaucracy delay it any longer. The council members huddled together for a whispered conference, while the other stakeholders waited in tense silence. Joseph found himself holding his breath, aware that the next few minutes would determine not just his family's fate, but the future character of an entire community. When Mayor Hayes finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had made a decision that would define her legacy. The council will postpone tonight's vote pending review of Mrs. Mansfield's formal proposal. Mr. Harrington, your offer will remain under consideration, but we feel obligated to fully explore all options before making such a significant decision. Anthony. Harrington's explosion of anger was immediate and predictable. This is a mistake that will cost you everything. Mark my words, in 6 months you'll be begging me to reconsider my offer, and by then it will be too late. He stormed out of the hangar, leaving his son standing among the group that had just dealt his development dreams a potentially fatal blow. David watched his father's departure with sad resignation, then turned back to the aircraft that had become the symbol of his own choice between profit and principle. I know this complicates things for your family, Joseph said to David, recognizing the courage it had taken to oppose his father so publicly. David shrugged with surprising equanimity. Some complications are worth having. Besides, I'd rather be remembered for helping preserve something beautiful than for helping destroy it. As the crowd began to disperse, Amanda Foster approached Joseph with a smile that transformed her professional demeanor into something warmer and more personal. Mr. Clark, Mrs. Mansfield asked me to tell you something specific if the aircraft proved authentic. Joseph waited, his heart still racing from the emotional roller coaster of the morning. She said that Charles would have been proud to know. His work was discovered by someone who understood the value of craftsmanship and community. She's looking forward to meeting the family that gave his dreams a second chance. Standing in the hangar, surrounded by his children, his friends, and the aircraft that had changed everything, Joseph felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Sometimes the most broken things really could be fixed, and sometimes fixing them led to healing you never expected. 3 weeks after the council meeting, Hangar 5 hummed with purposeful activity that would have been impossible to imagine during those desperate November days. Professional restoration equipment occupied every corner, from precision machining tools to environmental control systems that maintained optimal temperature and humidity for delicate metalwork. The transformation was so complete that Joseph sometimes had to remind himself this was the same space where he had first discovered Charles Mansfield's sleeping prototype. Helen Mansfield herself was scheduled to arrive this morning for her first visit to see the aircraft that had consumed her thoughts for 7 decades. At 78, she rarely traveled for business anymore, preferring to conduct most affairs through trusted representatives like Amanda Foster. But this journey was personal, in ways that transcended normal business considerations. Joseph stood before the prototype, which had been partially disassembled to allow detailed restoration of individual components. The engine sat on a specialized stand, its custom-built cylinders gleaming like jewelry after professional cleaning and inspection. Wing panels hung from precision fixtures, revealing the intricate internal structure that demonstrated Charles Mansfield's engineering genius. Violet emerged from beneath the fuselage where she had been working with master craftsman Gary Muller, a restoration specialist Helen had flown in from the Smithsonian. At 14, Violet possessed an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that impressed even seasoned professionals, and Gary had begun teaching her advanced techniques usually reserved for apprentices with years of experience. The control. "Cable routing is incredible," Violet announced, her face bright with excitement despite the early hour. "Mr. Muller says Charles designed redundant safety systems that wouldn't become standard for another 30 years. Blake looked up from his laptop where he had been documenting the restoration process for the Heritage Center's future educational programs. His systematic approach to record-keeping had caught Amanda Foster's attention, and she had suggested he might consider a career in museum administration or historical preservation. "The flight control engineering documentation is going to be amazing for the interactive displays," Blake said, consulting notes that had grown into a comprehensive catalogue. "Visitors will be able to understand exactly how revolutionary this aircraft was." Joseph felt the familiar surge of pride he experienced whenever his children demonstrated their growing expertise. The restoration project had become more than just mechanical work. It was education, inspiration, and healing wrapped together in a way that honored both the past and the future. Dr. Mitchell arrived carrying a leather satchel filled with original documents that Helen had provided from Charles's personal papers. The historian's face glowed with the excitement of someone who had spent his career studying legends and was now working with tangible reality. Mrs. Mansfield's driver called from the highway, Dr. Mitchell announced. "She'll be here within the hour. I've prepared a complete technical presentation about Charles's innovations, but I suspect she'll be more interested in the emotional aspects of seeing his work again." Richard Morrison appeared in the hangar doorway, his usual work clothes replaced by the dress uniform he had worn during his Air Force service decades earlier. The airport manager understood the significance of this moment, not just for Helen Mansfield, but for the entire community that had rallied around preserving aviation heritage. "The town council's already gathered at the terminal building," Richard reported. "Mayor Hayes wants to present Mrs. Mansfield with an honorary key to the city. Rose Sullivan's prepared a reception lunch, and half the town's planning to be here for the unveiling." Joseph nodded, feeling the weight of community expectations, along with his own nervous anticipation. Helen Mansfield's generosity had already transformed Hartwell's financial prospects, but her personal approval of their restoration work would validate months of careful labor and planning. David Harrington entered the hangar carrying architectural drawings for the Heritage Center's expansion plans. His relationship with his father remained strained following their public disagreement, but David had thrown himself into the preservation project with enthusiasm that suggested he had found his true calling. "The museum design is approved by the State Historical Commission," David announced, spreading blueprints across a workbench. "Construction can begin as soon as ground conditions permit in the spring. The main display hall will showcase the Mansfield prototype, while smaller galleries feature local aviation history." Amanda Foster arrived precisely on schedule, her efficient manner tempered by obvious emotional investment in the day's events. She had become a regular presence during the restoration planning, serving as liaison between Helen's Chicago headquarters and the Hartwell project team. "Mrs. Mansfield is 5 minutes out," Amanda announced. "I should mention that she's brought someone special with her, her granddaughter Sarah, who's been helping research her grandfather's legacy for a college thesis." The sound of approaching vehicles drew everyone outside, where a modest convoy was pulling up to the hangar. Helen Mansfield emerged from the lead car with the careful movements of someone who had learned to respect age while refusing to surrender to it. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her elegant clothing spoke of wealth, but her eyes held the brightness of someone still actively engaged with the world around her. Beside her stood a young woman in her early 20s whose resemblance to Helen was unmistakable. Sarah Mansfield possessed the same intelligent eyes and determined jawline, though her casual academic attire suggested interests that ran toward research rather than business. Helen paused at the hangar entrance, her hand resting lightly on Amanda's arm for support. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of someone accustomed to addressing boardrooms and charitable gatherings, but there was an underlying tremor that revealed the depth of her emotional investment. Mr. Clark, I cannot adequately express what this moment means to me. For 75 years, I've wondered what became of Charles's work, to discover it preserved and honored by people who understand its significance. Her voice trailed off as she caught her first glimpse of the partially restored aircraft. The strong composure she had maintained throughout decades of business success cracked visibly, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as she approached the prototype that represented her lost love's greatest achievement. "It's exactly as I remembered," she whispered, reaching out to touch the wing with trembling fingers. Charles spent months perfecting these curves, calculating every angle for optimal airflow. He believed this aircraft could change the future of aviation. Sarah stepped beside her grandmother, producing a worn leather journal from her backpack. "Grandma Helen, look at this entry from October 10th, 1947. Grandfather wrote about hoping to test the prototype after completing the military contract." Helen accepted the journal with reverent care, her eyes scanning handwriting that had once been as familiar as her own. He never got the chance. 5 days later, he was gone, and I thought all his dreams had died with him. Joseph approached, the elderly woman with the respectful caution appropriate to someone meeting a legend. "Mrs. Mansfield, your husband's engineering was decades ahead of its time. Every component we've examined reveals innovations that wouldn't become standard until the jet age." Helen nodded, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief that had been carefully pressed for this occasion. "Charles always said he was building for the stars, but he was grounded by love for his family. I used to worry that I held him back from achieving his full potential. You gave him something to build for," Violet said with the directness that characterized her generation. "The inscription on the brass plate proves that. He wasn't held back by love. He was inspired by it." Helen turned to study Violet with obvious interest, perhaps recognizing something of her own youthful determination in the teenager's earnest expression. "And what do you hope to build, young lady?" "I want to restore aircraft like this one," Violet replied without hesitation. "Mr. Muller's been teaching me advanced techniques, and Blake's documenting everything so future restorers can learn from. Our work, a worthy ambition," Helen said, her business instincts clearly engaged. "The aviation industry needs more people who understand that craftsmanship is just as important as technology." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with his presentation. Materials, eager to share his technical analysis of Charles's innovations. For the next hour, the group moved systematically through the restoration area, while the historian explained each discovery and innovation they had documented. Helen listened with the focused attention of someone absorbing information that would reshape her understanding of her late husband's capabilities. Sarah took detailed notes for her thesis research, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated inherited intellectual curiosity. When the technical presentation concluded, Helen requested a few minutes alone with the aircraft. The restoration team respectfully withdrew to the hangar's office area, leaving her standing beside the prototype with only Amanda and Sarah for company. Through the office windows, Joseph watched Helen place both hands on the aircraft's fuselage, her lips moving in what appeared to be a private conversation with memories that had waited 3/4 of a century for resolution. Whatever she was saying to Charles's ghost, it carried the weight of a lifetime's accumulated grief, pride, and love. When she finally rejoined the group, Helen's composure had returned, but her expression carried a peace that hadn't been there. When she arrived, "Mr. Clark, I have a proposition for you and your family." Joseph felt his heart rate accelerate, uncertain what new developments this remarkable day might bring. "I would like to establish the Charles Mansfield Institute for Aviation Innovation here in Hartwell. The prototype will be its centerpiece, but the institute will also provide scholarships for young people interested in aviation careers, fund research into sustainable aircraft technologies, and support community development through heritage tourism." The scope of Helen's vision took everyone's breath away. She wasn't just preserving one aircraft, she was creating a legacy that would honor her husband's memory while providing educational and economic opportunities for generations of future aviation enthusiasts. "Mrs. Mansfield," Joseph managed to say, "that's incredibly generous, but we're just a small town with limited resources." Helen smiled with the confidence of someone who had spent decades turning ambitious visions into reality. "Mr. Clark, small. Towns with big dreams have changed the world before. Charles grew up in a place very much like Hartwell. Sometimes the most important innovations come from people who aren't limited by conventional thinking about what's possible." As the morning progressed into afternoon celebration, Joseph found himself marveling at how completely their lives had been transformed by discovering one sleeping aircraft in a forgotten hangar. What had begun as a desperate search for financial salvation had evolved into something far more significant, a connection to history, a commitment to community, and a bridge between past dreams and future possibilities. 6 months later, the sound of propeller engines filled the South Dakota sky as aircraft from across the nation converged on Hartwell for the grand opening of the Charles Mansfield Institute for Aviation Innovation. Joseph stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed facility, watching vintage warbirds and modern aircraft taxi toward the expanded terminal that had replaced the modest building where this journey began. The transformation was breathtaking. Where once stood a struggling rural airport, now rose a world-class aviation heritage center that attracted visitors from every continent. The main exhibition hall housed Charles Mansfield's beautifully restored prototype, its aluminum skin gleaming under museum lighting that highlighted every curve and detail that had captured Helen's heart 7 decades earlier. Violet appeared. Beside her father, no longer the curious teenager who had crawled under dusty wing panels, but a confident young woman wearing the coveralls of an official restoration technician. Her acceptance into the Smithsonian's prestigious apprenticeship program had been announced the previous week, fulfilling dreams that hadn't existed before she touched her first aircraft rivet. The control towers reporting 43 visiting. "Aircraft so far," Violet announced, consulting a radio in her hand. "Mr. Merler says that's more vintage aircraft in one place than most people see in a lifetime." Joseph nodded, still struggling to fully comprehend how completely their lives had changed. The Clark family now lived in a restored farmhouse on the Institute grounds, provided as part of Joseph's position as Director of Historical Preservation. The financial struggles that had once threatened to destroy them seemed like distant memories from someone else's life. Blake emerged from the education center where he had been conducting tours for visiting students. His natural organizational skills and business acumen had made him indispensable to the Institute's operation, and several universities were already recruiting him for their museum studies programs. "The student groups are incredible," Blake reported, enthusiastically. "Kids from 12 different states, all here because they heard about the Mansfield prototype and wanted to learn about aviation innovation. Some of them are already talking about careers in aerospace engineering." Through the observation deck's windows, Joseph could see Helen Mansfield moving slowly through the main exhibition, using a walking cane, but maintaining the erect posture of someone who refused to surrender to age. At 78, she had thrown herself into the Institute's development with energy that amazed everyone around her, personally reviewing every detail from the interactive displays to the scholarship program criteria. Richard Morrison approached, carrying a clipboard thick with the day's logistics, his face bearing the satisfied expression of someone watching his life's work validated on a scale he had never imagined possible. The former airport manager now served as the Institute's Director of Operations, overseeing a facility that employed 37 people and attracted over 50,000 visitors annually. "The memorial service is ready to begin," Richard announced, quietly. Helen's asked for just family and close friends for this part. The group made their way to the memorial garden that had been constructed adjacent to the main building. At its center stood a simple granite monument bearing Charles Mansfield's name, birth date, and the date of his disappearance, along with the words from his brass plate, "Built for the stars, grounded by love." Helen stood before the monument, with Sarah at her side, the young woman now pursuing her doctorate in aviation history with a dissertation focused on her grandfather's revolutionary designs. Amanda Foster and Dr. Mitchell flanked them, representing the professional relationships that had become deep personal friendships through shared dedication to preserving Charles's legacy. 75 years ago today, Charles took off on his final flight. Helen began, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "For most of my life, that date represented ending, loss, and dreams unfulfilled. Today, surrounded by young people who are inspired by his work and a community that has embraced his memory, I understand that it wasn't an ending at all." Joseph found himself thinking about Grace as Helen spoke, recognizing the profound truth that love doesn't disappear. When physical presence ends, it transforms into something that can inspire and sustain across generations, just as Charles's passion for innovation had eventually led to opportunities for Violet, Blake, and countless other young people who would benefit from the Institute's programs. Charles believed that the most important innovations come from people who dare to imagine possibilities that others consider impossible. Helen continued. The Clark family exemplified that spirit when they chose to restore rather than abandon what they found. This institute exists because they understood that some discoveries are too important to keep to themselves. After the ceremony, the group moved back to the main exhibition, where hundreds of visitors were examining the prototype and learning about its revolutionary features through interactive displays that Blake had helped design. The aircraft sat in a place of honor, surrounded by photographs, documents, and artifacts that told the complete story of Charles Mansfield's brief but brilliant career. David Harrington appeared at Joseph's elbow, wearing the satisfied expression of an architect, seeing his vision realized in steel and glass. His relationship with his father had never fully recovered from their public disagreement, but David had found purpose in historical preservation that more than compensated for the loss of his expected inheritance. The heritage tourism numbers exceeded all projections, David reported with obvious pride. Hotel bookings in Hartwell are solid through next summer, and 3 new restaurants have opened to serve visitors. Your decision to fight for this place transformed the entire regional economy. Joseph smiled, remembering the desperate November days when $8,000 had seemed like an impossible sum. The Institute's annual operating budget now approached $8 million, supporting not just the facility itself, but dozens of local businesses that served the steady stream of aviation enthusiasts who made pilgrimages to see Charles Mansfield's prototype. Sophia Martinez approached carrying a group of her high school students who were participating in the Institute's educational outreach program. Several of her former pupils had already received Mansfield scholarships to pursue aviation careers, and the ripple effects were being felt throughout the region's educational system. "Mr. Clark," Sophia called with genuine excitement, "I wanted you to meet Maria Santos. She's a sophomore now, but she's already been accepted into the Air Force Academy for early admission. She says seeing the Mansfield prototype convinced her that she wanted to design aircraft." Joseph shook hands with the confident young woman, seeing in her eyes the same spark of possibility that had driven Charles Mansfield to push the boundaries of what aircraft could achieve. The Institute wasn't just preserving history, it was actively creating future innovators who would carry aviation into realms that Charles could only have dreamed about. As the afternoon progressed, Joseph found himself standing once again beside the prototype that had changed everything. The aircraft looked magnificent in its restored condition. Every surface polished to mirror brightness, every component rebuilt to exact specifications, using techniques that honored Charles's original craftsmanship while incorporating modern materials science. Helen appeared beside him, moving slowly but with obvious satisfaction as she surveyed the crowds of people examining her late husband's work. "Joseph, I have something I've been waiting to give you." She handed him a small, wrapped package that contained a leather journal identical to the one Sarah had shown them months earlier. Inside the front cover, Charles Mansfield's handwriting was clearly visible. "For the craftsman who gives my dreams new life." Charles wrote that inscription in 1947, Helen explained with tears in her eyes. He somehow knew that someday someone would find his work and understand its importance. "I think he would be proud of everything you and your family have accomplished." Joseph felt overwhelmed by the weight of connection spanning 3/4 of a century. The journal represented more than just historical artifact. It was validation that his family's journey had honored the memory of someone who had dared to reach for the stars, despite being grounded by the responsibilities of love. As evening approached and the day's festivities wound down, Joseph stood with Violet and Blake on the observation deck, watching aircraft depart into a sunset that painted the prairie sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new students, and new opportunities to share the story of how broken dreams could be rebuilt into something more beautiful than originally imagined. "Dad," Violet said quietly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found the prototype?" Joseph considered the question carefully, thinking about all the paths their lives might have taken. "I think we would have found another way to survive, but we wouldn't have discovered how much we were capable of achieving when we stopped focusing on just surviving and started building something meaningful." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "It's like what Charles wrote on that brass plate. We were all grounded by love, love for each other, love for the community, love for craftsmanship. But that grounding gave us the foundation to reach higher than we ever thought possible." As the last aircraft disappeared into the distance, Joseph felt a profound sense of completeness settle over him. The financial struggles that had once threatened to destroy his family had led them to discover their true purpose. The community that had rallied around preserving aviation heritage had found sustainable prosperity through honoring its past. And somewhere in the evening sky, Joseph liked to imagine that Charles Mansfield was finally at peace, knowing that his dreams had taken flight in ways he never could have anticipated. The journey that began with a desperate search for $8,000 had become something immeasurably more valuable, a legacy of innovation, community, and hope that would inspire generations of dreamers to believe that even the most impossible visions could become reality with enough determination, skill, and love. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're looking for something else entirely. Sometimes fixing what's broken leads to healing we never expected, and sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a single step into a forgotten hangar where dreams have been waiting patiently for someone brave, enough to believe they're worth rebuilding. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.